everyone. Thanks again for joining us. How are you doing, Shawnee K?
Living the dream, changing lives one day at a time.
Man, this week I really appreciate you because I feel like we had a lot of great conversations in the office, and we're talking about how it would be nice if we could just record those conversations. And this is kind of why we have the podcast, so that we can kind of sum up what we discussed during the week.
Yeah, and consolidate our knowledge and become a bit more eloquent about it. Because I think what we find is the second or third time you go through talking about something, you really start sort of narrowing in on that kernel of the idea so that you can be a bit more proactive about how you're going to approach it and maybe try and solve it.
And I really appreciated seeing you do your science lab project with the fifth graders. You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. So David and I this year have been really working on trying to put a real world context into our science students in particular. And if you follow David on YouTube, you know that that's what he's been all about for years. And so this unit, we're really talking about plants, ecosystems, things like that. And we've given the students in our classes the challenge of making what we're calling a microfarm and seeing how much food they can grow in their classroom. So it's really cool. So this week they were making their microfarms, essentially kind of modified recycled products into plants, plant holders or pots. And now what they're doing is they're growing things like lettuce, spinach. There's some kids making cherry tomatoes, other things like that. And we're just going to see what sort of volume of food they can grow, how much effort it takes, how much time it takes, so they can start to get an understanding of, in the real world, when you go to the supermarket, where does that lettuce come from and where does the tomato come from and those sort of things.
So yeah, I think your project is a great example of what we're going to talk about today. Today's Iceberg is basically how we can disrupt education, traditional education, by designing more wicked learning experiences for students and instead of kind. And what I mean by that is in David Epstein's book, Range, he talks about wicked learning experiences where there are no clear rules and it's very open-ended and students have a lot of choice and decision-making. And kind is the opposite, where there are rules and things are really set and there's parameters.
And it's kind of like a plug-and-play sort of situation here.
And that really resonated with me, the wicked learning environment, because what you see right now when people try to explain what the future will look like, what work and daily life will look like, it's going to be wicked. The World Economic Forum that met this January, where 2,300 leaders came together to tackle some of the pressing challenges that the world faces. Basically, the goal is to create the groundwork for a more resilient, sustainable world. And to do this, we have to have some promising innovations that we can scale.
So just to add on to that in a really direct kind of educational sense, I know Dan Meyer, who's a math consultant, talks about, he doesn't term it wicked and kind learning, but he talks about the fact that in schools often we just give a plug and play thing. So it's here is X, here is Y, use this formula, you get the answer. But he says in real life, what you have is you either have no information or you have too much information. And so it's that idea that you're either looking at something, having to filter out what's good and what's bad to be able to create a solution, or you're looking at it and you don't have the information and you have to either assume, measure, infer, to come up with some solution that kind of works. And that's really the heart, I think, that I take away of wicked learning is it's that extra challenge that is more realistic in regard to what we see in our everyday life when we're doing things.
Yeah. So as educators, we are designers. We constantly are designing these learning experiences. We just have the choice of making it wicked or making it kind. Majority of the time, students would think it is kind because in the 2019 Gallup survey stated that 26% of students feel like what they're learning in these projects, they can actually apply it in the real world. So that's only 26%, which is pretty low, but you thought actually...
I was going to say, the funny thing about that result is that also 50% of teachers thought that they could be used in the real world or they were similar to a real world situation. And I don't know, I guess when we talked about it, I kind of thought that a quarter of students thinking things could be applied in their real life, I thought was kind of high. When you think about the way kids talk about school and a general notion of how they feel about that system. So, but yeah, I think it's a really great challenge for us to be able to think about what are some ways we can get kids involved in problems and learning in a way that mimics what we see in the real world and in our life on the day-to-day, rather than in kind of some sort of simulated way that makes it so simple relatively, to be able to plug and play and get your answer out.
Yeah, and I mean the survey kind of shows there's a disconnect. If the teachers feel like it's real world and the students don't, I mean there's a huge disconnect. And what can we do as educators to ensure that students really believe that all of these skills, knowledge that they're gaining, they can actually apply?
So, like, as we've been talking in the office about some examples that we've seen along the way, and one school that stands out for me is the Austin Tinkering School, which comes out of Guy Vitale, who ran the Tinkering School, who's done the TED Talk from a long time ago, which is really about putting tools in the hands of kids and then asking them to build things and solve problems like that. And when I see, in particular, their Instagram feed, the kids are outside all the time. They're cutting wood, and it's not just cutting wood, but they're building things. So, recently they built a working elevator, out of wood, out of framing lumber and things like that. And so it's not to say that that's a real world problem either. I'm not saying that we have to go and build a whole heap of elevators everywhere, but I like the fact that these kids are not sitting answering a question about how big is an elevator and calculating the area of plywood in a fictional world you would have to buy. They're literally out there measuring first, hopefully, measuring, cutting, and constructing things to see if they can work together as a team and make things happen. So that's a real standout for me that I really enjoy watching sort of come along. I would love to be able to be at that school if someone's listening knows people at the school, but I would like to know about what their pathways are from school, because I don't imagine they're a school that have kids sit down and do SATs and then complete the exam and go to college necessarily. Yeah. I'm sure those kids still go to college, right, and it's probably with some sort of portfolio that they apply. I think what they're looking at is maybe interpersonal skills is probably a big part of that, as well as the physical understanding of how things work so that things can be built on. And I know that's a technical area that doesn't necessarily address maybe kids who want to go into social studies or are really keen on reading and writing and things like that. But I think it's nice to see a school that has some focus that adapts to people who are really hands-on and want to have that experience.
Yeah, we also saw an interview of Elon Musk. I know he's a controversial figure, but he was just talking about how he has built a school for his children. In the interview, he was talking about it's very much self-directed learning. It's less focused on teaching the tools, but actually just providing a problem and then using that problem scenario to teach those skills and teach the tools. So instead of having the students study about the hammer, the kids would be given an engine.
So we do know that everything can be fixed with a hammer.
Yeah.
It is a great video though, because it does talk about that idea that things need to be contextualized. If you provide the students with the tools as they need them, it makes much more impact and is more lasting in regard to what they understand and they take away, than if you're just sporadically teaching a concept, hoping it stays there for a long time until 5 years later they have to apply it. If it's in the situation, that's a much more purposeful way to do it.
Yeah, and Elon was just saying that how he didn't enjoy school, and a big principle for this school, this unschooling concept that he has, thinking about the students' preferences and their passions, using that to create that self-directed learning.
Another thing I like about that type of work, and I'm thinking a bit more about what we talked about with the Tinkering School just now, is that it is also a really directed way to talk to kids about learning how to learn. And I think that's something that people pay a lot of lip service to, is we want to teach kids to learn how to learn, but we don't necessarily give them a lot of opportunities to do that, because more often than not, it's like you mentioned at the start of the episode, it's kind learning where it's X, Y, formula, answer, right, as opposed to how are you going to figure out how to do this? And I think about a really weird example about a friend of mine who was a contractor. He largely did buildings and things like that, but on the side he would fix cars. And I would ask him about how he learned these things, and it was literally just a YouTube thing. he would go and like hop on YouTube, look for someone who's had that problem. It might not be exactly what he's after, but then he would learn from that. And I think there's much more learning how to learn in that process than there is sometimes in some of the things we're doing at schools, which don't necessarily offer that opportunity.
Your example kind of reminds me of a quote I got for my book. But I interviewed the CEO of Shaker.
What's his name?
His name is David Lee as well. Yes, something about that name.
Yeah.
I asked him, like, what type of employee would you be looking for? And he was just saying how he's very confident in himself and he feels like he's very creative and he has the vision for what the company should look like. But then from there, the employees just take that and run with it. It's not a scripted thing that David has to write out. It's not this list of expectations that you have to do it this way, this way, this way. It's really that self-directed learning. He was just talking about this person who had no experience at all, but had that mentality, had that mindset of really, truly understanding the vision of the company and creating something more awesome than he thought was possible. I think that's kind of the goal, right? We want to produce those type of entrepreneurial people.
When I think about that idea of what sort of choices do kids have at school. They have choices with like a lowercase c or like a capital C. So the idea of like you choose your paper color, or you choose what you're learning, or you choose like maybe like where you sit in the classroom, or you choose like how you're going to or how you're going to research something and how you're going to answer that along the way. One of the things I think about is the idea of using like problem-based learning, or PBL as people know it, and an inquiry process to get teachers on the road to providing that choice. And it's not to like go from night to day and just say all of a sudden like my kids have all the choice in the world. I do think problem-based learning and like an inquiry process do open up doors for teachers to be able to give more autonomy to students to make them more self-directed learners. So it also takes a bit of pressure off the teacher to some degree of you have to provide, like you said with David Lee's quote, you have to provide a vision of where we're going, but you don't necessarily have to like have it mapped out step by step, day by day, hour by hour. And giving over that control is not always easy as a teacher, but I think it's something that can be valuable for both parties. Like it takes a bit of pressure off the teacher. It also gives a sense of autonomy and freedom to a student that might not have that at all at school sometimes.
Right. But I kind of see it as a spectrum. Like in one end, it's traditional. And I see project-based learning kind of in the middle because it is standards-based. And because it's standards-based, the context is created. And within that context, students have voice and choice. But then on the other end, we have personalized inquiry projects that we've tried with fifth grade. And that's very open-ended. The students get to identify their passion, get to identify within that passion what work would they do, and they can plan out their action plan. It's more of an extreme, wicked learning environment. Anybody can start, whether they're in traditional, they can move towards project-based learning. As they get familiar with that, are more willing to let go, then they can move towards more personalized inquiry projects.
I think a great first step for teachers is to stop answering questions. I got that from a PD I went to once where it was an inquiry PD, and the instructor basically said, the best answer you can give a student is like, I don't know. And with the supportive notion of saying, how can we find out?
Right.
And I think there's a certain power in that of just not necessarily telling your kids all the time you don't know things, but saying like that idea of like, how can we find out? Or how can you find out? And then supporting them on that journey. And I think if you're a teacher who is new to this idea or just wants to try something different, I think that's a great place to start.
Absolutely. And if you're a parent too, a great place to start is with your kids. Just say, I don't know, like, let's figure it out together. I do that a lot where there's a question, I'm not sure, I'll Google it. And then how does the actual thing work? And then we'll kind of figure that out together. And so
what we're saying this week is, as an Iceberg, trying to give your students more voice and choice by providing like a wicked environment, an environment that doesn't have all the answers, one where they have to do some of the work to like find out what's going on. And really, we would love to know what you guys are up to in terms of like, do you have initiatives or programs at your school or at home or otherwise that you think really open those doors for students. And if you do, if you can share them, we'd love to shout them out at some stage on the podcast as well. Well, Dave, like I have a Lego appointment with a 2.5-year-old. So I'm going to probably have to roll in a minute. What are you up to this afternoon?
My wife is waiting for me. So
yeah.
Yeah.
Seems like the time.
Yep.
Remember, be the iceberg.
Climb the mountain.